a podcast designed to help heal and support the El Paso community. Hello, I'm your host, Mariana Sierra, Outreach Coordinator for the El Paso United Family Resiliency Center, a program of United Way of El Paso County. We are dedicated to serve those who were impacted directly or indirectly by August 3rd. Join us on the journey to long-term recovery as we have honest conversations with local leaders, mental health specialists, and fellow El Pasoans who share their stories and expertise. We feature topics that influence and impact the vitality and resilience of our community. We are El Paso United, and together we heal. Juntos sanamos. Dear listener, before we begin, a note of warning. The topic we're about to explore contains a mention of the mass casualty event and a description of the events that unfolded thereafter. This episode may not be suitable for everyone. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of United and Resilient. During the month of April, the FRC joins national efforts in raising awareness on sexual assault. The FRC understands that abuse and violence can come in different shapes and forms, and it's important to recognize that sexual assault can touch the lives of many, regardless of their age, race, sexual orientation, or gender. For this episode, we had a touching but insightful conversation with Sandra Garcia, Executive Director of Center Against Sexual and Family Violence. And throughout our conversation, we'll speak on the common stigmas that surround sexual assault and the importance of providing safe spaces for our youth to be educated and listened to. We will also discuss how we can move from awareness to action that can actually transcend and make a huge impact in our society. Sandra, welcome to United and Resilient.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you for having us.
Sandra, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, the work that CASFV does, and a little bit about your journey and experience in this role?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, my name is Sandra Garcia. I am the Executive Director for the Center, and I've had the pleasure of working with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault for the past 18 years. I originally started as an advocate in our emergency shelter. From them, just progressed throughout the agency to be our shelter director and then our director of client services for about 10 years. So I've done a multitude of jobs within the organization in sense of working directly with clients, answering hotlines, doing hospital accompaniment, providing expert witness for court cases that may have needed some additional information and some education for the jury. And so the work that we do at the center is just something that I absolutely fell in love with. I'm not a social worker by trade in the sense that I majored in criminal justice with a minor in psychology. So I giggle because it wasn't an area necessarily that I was pursuing, but it was one that once I had exposure to, I absolutely fell in love with the work, and have had the opportunity to work alongside wonderful staff throughout these years, and particularly to have the ability to meet some of the strongest individuals in our community as they work through their personal situations in dealing with the domestic violence and sexual assault.
Well, that is wonderful, Sandra. I'm very pleased with you being here in our podcast because I know you can provide a lot of insight and a lot of education to our audience. And at this moment, would you tell us a little bit about your organization's work and their commitment that they have to our Borderland?
Absolutely. So the Center Against Sexual and Family Violence has gone through a couple of stages of growth, if you will. And so when I first started, we used to be called your Shelter for Battered Women in the community. And so we are your local rape crisis center and your local domestic violence program that provides services to Hudspeth, Culberson, and El Paso counties. So the center in itself has grown significantly throughout the time that I've been with the agency. We started primarily as an emergency shelter. That's probably what we're known more for in the community. But that program has grown into our Family Resource Center, our Battery Intervention and Prevention program, and now converted that over to our prevention and intervention program, working with primary prevention along with accountability groups for aggressors. And so what the center provides in terms of the community is not only emergency shelter that's comprehensive in the sense of you have access to a 24-hour hotline. There is 24-hour staff. People come into shelter at any particular time just as an as-needed basis. But that program in itself has a children's program, advocates or slash caseworkers that work with our clients to help them navigate the system and connect them to different resources in our community. But we also have a full-fledged commercial-sized kitchen because we provide all their meals, from breakfast, lunch, dinner, 3:30 and 7:30 snack. And so we're able to provide emergency shelter to anywhere between 800 individuals to the upwards of a little over 1,000, depending on the year. I will say that in our emergency shelter, the highest number of individuals are our children. So each adult will come in, as you can imagine, with either as a single individual or a family. I think the largest we've had is like a family of 9 that's come in and sought shelter. And so those individuals are just connected, provided, supported, and given just the services that they might need at this particular time, and really kind of connected them to maybe other services that they weren't aware of. So then when you think of that's our residential component. So we have a whole other side, which is our non-residential. And I think the non-residential is something I always love to highlight, because I think oftentimes the community thinks of the centers as a shelter. And while that's the most immediate type of service, right? And in the sense of its accessibility 24 hours a day, our Family Resource Center actually sees probably about 3,200 clients a year. And so that program provides the same services that the shelter does, except obviously they don't live there. And so these individuals come in for advocacy, support groups, therapy, immigration services, workforce services, just depending what it is that they need. So not every individual or every victim of domestic violence or sexual assault will need shelter or want to come to shelter. Oftentimes they do have some other level of support. And so the Family Resource Center, so our FRC is what we call it, really comes into play to provide that continual support and connect that continuum of care. So if you went to shelter, you can continue services here. If you never needed to go to shelter, you continue with services here at our Family Resource Center.
Awesome. Well, I admire CASFV and what they do for our community. I think it's so important to provide these services when you're dealing with something like this, with violence, with domestic violence, sexual violence. It's so vital for you to have a helping hand and for you to have someone to go to professional help. So thank you so much for your commitment that you have for our community members. And actually, our FRC, the Family Resiliency Center, does have a partnership with you all. And we are so excited to have this partnership. Because as we mentioned before in this podcast, we definitely believe that non-traditional therapy can support traditional therapy and can be a segue to traditional therapy. So CASFV is one of our partners. It's one of our providers of this non-traditional therapy. So would you please take this moment to discuss one of the services that we have that we provide through our FRC?
Definitely. So I think that it's something that I think we were really privileged to be a part of. So there is a series of classes that are being offered through the Family Resiliency Center by our staff. And so it's wanting to connect with individuals on different levels. And so we encourage you to, go to the United Way event page and look at the calendar, as it may change from month to month. But we have Nurturing Inside Out. So talking about strengthening families and that family dynamic, because I know that can oftentimes be challenging. We also have our Stand By or Stand Up, which is talking about like prevention and advocating and learning skills and knowledge. And so a lot of times we are privy to situations and we're trying to figure out, how do we intervene? Should we not intervene? What are things that we can do to support one another? And so looking at those different tactics or tools, or figuring out how I can be a better neighbor, if you will, is also really important. And then we also have our empowering family dynamics, so building healthy families. And so I think, we all have a concept of what a healthy family looks like. That doesn't always mean that that's the way our family looks like. And I think oftentimes, rather than trying to achieve that goal, we get stuck, right? Because we're individuals that we're creatures of habit. And so we go back to what we know. And so talking about like, what does that look like for your family? What are some easy kind of tidbits and tools that we can do and start with that can start to develop and cultivate those healthy relationships within our own networks, right? Our own nucleus of our family is really important. And then also creating healthy boundaries. Boundaries are always something that's challenging. I think obviously as a Hispanic in a predominantly Hispanic community, it's something that we don't, especially as women, really focus on. Oftentimes there's some things that we might do culturally that kind of push our boundaries, but we partake in the activities because we are Hispanic. That's the way we were brought up. That's just something we do. It's custom, it's tradition. Just healthy boundaries is talking about what are those things and what makes sense for you as an individual, for you as a family unit, for you as a household, and how do you start to bring up those conversations, or maybe even as an audience member or a participant in these programs, is you sharing with the group of what has worked for you is really important. So it's really kind of a give and take on multiple levels over various sessions.
100%. And Sandra, something that you brought up, and it's so important about the establishing healthy families. I think back when I was, in high school and middle school, we didn't have these tools, and especially for healthy relationships. And as you grow up, you're like, where was this information when I and I'm so thankful that you guys are providing this information for families, for youth, because it can prevent so many things. And it, like I said in the beginning, it can provide a helping hand, right? Again, I go back to my high school years. I think it's so crucial to provide this education for young adults on how to establish healthy relationships and have an honest discussion about what are the red flags and what are the things that you should be looking at and what are the things that are not okay. And you might think it's okay because, society has established certain standards that are not healthy at all. So we definitely do provide those classes and those workshops thanks to our relationship with CASFV. So definitely do log into our website and see the services that we provide, because they're all great. I've taken them, and I think they're wonderful. And like I said, I go back to my younger years and I'm like, where was this? This is so great. Like I would have benefited so much from all of this information. But now, Sandra, I want to talk about, this month, April, is Sexual Violence Awareness Month. And that's why we wanted to have an honest conversation with an expert about these issues. And we see so many movements, right? We see the feminist movement, we see the Women's March, and it feels like there's a more open discussion about sexual violence, the red flags, prevention. Yet, what are some of the common stigmas that are surrounding this topic till this day?
So that's a great question. I think that while we've made huge strides in multiple areas, it also almost feels like we're still stuck in certain areas, oddly enough. So when you think of, for instance, males coming forward as victims of sexual assault, oftentimes people still cannot conceptualize how that can happen and that a man cannot be raped. The LGBTQ community falls under the same myth or misconception. The idea that with sexual assault in particular, even I think more so than domestic violence, we victimize and blame the victim for the action that's happened.
Yes.
It's oftentimes, if you, when we were talking about this. Well, we've had multiple conversations, obviously, as you can imagine, within our organization. But when someone's sexually assaulted, this idea of, well, where were they, right? Like,
yes, that's
how
the
did it
first
happen?
question that they ask. Yeah.
Right. And God forbid you were, out having a drink because, well, that's what happened. God forbid you didn't park by the, huge parking lot light, because then you should have parked there. Yet when you think of other types of crimes, like if someone was burglarized, right, or someone broke into your car or whatnot, you're not immediately questioning them of, well, where did you park? And, oh my God, well, why do you have such a nice car? They wouldn't have stolen it if it wasn't so nice. What kind of house do you have and where do you live? Well, that's why they burglarized you. With victims, those conversations don't happen. Yet with a victim of sexual assault, immediately we start judging unknowingly. I think sometimes for some reason we've been socialized that when something like a sexual assault happens, immediately it couldn't have happened to a man, right? Because they're lying. It was partially your fault if you were drinking or doing drugs. If you're a sex worker of any type, if you work in the adult industry, entertainment industry, there's no way that person could have been raped, because look at what they already do. And then the other biggest one is that they try to come up with is it has to be a false claim, right? Those reports are just not true. More people report sexual assault is falsely, and that's absolutely not true. It's actually not any more than any other crime, and the percentage is extremely low. It's anywhere between, depending on which report you read, it's between 2 and 8% of false reporting, which is very online with pretty much any other type of crime. So when individuals are disclosing, especially if it is a male, if it is someone from the LGBTQ community, if it's an individual, a child, oftentimes those I think are really difficult cases to deal with for a family member. It's they must have misunderstood. It didn't happen. They're making it up. And I think right there is like step one, like you've already created a barrier. So the main thing is to make sure that you believe what they're saying, trust what they're saying.
Yes, I agree with you. And I would add, Sandra, just because of experiences that I had with friends, that I have with friends currently, even if it's something that happened 10, 15 years ago, I do see the stigma of, well, why didn't he or she say something back then when it happened? And I think that's one of the most relevant things that I've seen, that there's a lot of judgment if you didn't speak up. And I guess I go back to what I said at the beginning, right? It's just so hard to speak about these issues. And, we have to respect the healing path and everyone's timing. I guess I also see the stigma of people making that judgment that they might not respect that.
No, definitely. And I think, so looking at even the cases with, like you're saying, with your friends, oftentimes you have to remember that, so the age of vulnerability for males and females are all under the age of 25. So if you think of women are most vulnerable between the ages of 18 and 24. And then males is adolescent to preteens. And so if you think about who has exposure to these individuals, it's oftentimes family members, family friends, individuals that we're interacting with. And so when you think about what those experiences could have been or what that exposure is these are incidents where, one, they're still trying to figure out just what's even going on, right, with my body. What does that kind of look like? And so the small percentage, I think, of individuals who make those outcries, when we think about, well, why didn't you ever say anything? Well, if that individual who may have victimized me was a family friend that everyone thinks, is a wonderful person, or that family member, and even as a child, like, how do you explain that uncle so-and-so did something that was inappropriate or touched you inappropriately? Or how do you explain that your brother or sister, engaged in this kind of behavior? And so a lot of times, unfortunately, there isn't an outcry. And so what tends to happen is as we grow up and we start to enter the world of dating and other relationships, these circumstances can then become barriers in these current relationships, obviously change the way we look at our own sexuality and intimacy with our partners. And so that's when these topics will come up and people hopefully will start to seek services for them. But the simple act of making that outcry when you're a child, and to be able to verbalize it, and how do you do that? So if you think about an adult having to make that outcry, and the determination that it takes and the courage that it takes, oftentimes children either don't have the vocabulary or can't explain it, and also are trying to understand it amongst everything. And it's scary. I'm not sure I want to do that and then have to tear my family apart, because you know that's going to be a topic of conversation if you're believed, right? Because oftentimes you must have misunderstood because Uncle Joe would have never done something like that. Or are you sure? So going back to how we treat victims, specifically with sexual assault, right away we go into a questioning stage rather than a believing stage, and validating those feelings and those situations for them.
Yes, I was actually writing something the other day about sexual violence and awareness. And one of the things that I was writing was that whenever someone is coming to you, chances are you're the first person that they're reaching out to say, to share their experience, to share their story. So one of the crucial things to do is to listen, and just don't make questions and be genuinely listen. So thank you for sharing that. I do agree with that, because sometimes when we're younger, we really don't understand a lot of things that are going on. And now, Sandra, I want to talk about what are the things that has been done to remove these stigmas, and what can we look forward to doing or working on to remove all the stigmas that we have discussed?
So a couple of different aspects, I guess, come to mind. So one is obviously awareness, right? Awareness that it exists. What does it look like? How does it, potentially start? And statistical information in terms of how many individuals will be affected, right? So the 1 in 4 females will be affected by some sort of sexual violence, or the 1 in 6 males. That whole idea that they normally, 80% of individuals do know the offender. The other part of it is also education in a different aspect, I think. We're fortunate enough as an organization to have our primary prevention program, which has an empowerment project. And so what this is it's housed, we started in Andress and worked with the feeder pattern there. And so we have 2 staff members that work with the youth in that area, and really work around the idea of, like, how do we come up with our thoughts and ideas revolving around relationships and intimacy, and how is that, what do you think of, what should a female portray or a male portray, and what are those characteristics, and how do you explain that? And so with primary prevention in their curriculum, they really work around kind of bringing up those questions for you as a young adult. So all day long, every day, whether it's through the music we listen to, advertisements, even clothing advertisements, not even just regular commercials, we're being fed information. And that then builds and forms our ideas around intimacy, around, sex, males, females. And so this program really works on, how do you dissect that? Is that accurate? Is that reality? How do we not, as individuals, perpetrate sexual violence? So, we all have friends, we all hang out, we all, pass memes to each other or jokes or whatnot. So how is it that as an individual, I might be I might be feeding into the sexual violence culture by, not either correcting or questioning my friend when they make a joke about an individual or another person, or share something that's inappropriate. And rather than having that difficult conversation with someone, I just brush it off, and like remove myself from the circumstance. And so I think that we're to the point where we're open enough where we can start to have these conversations and really try to keep each other accountable for our actions, and let individuals know that as a society, the first step happens with us of sharing the message that isn't okay, that is not correct. It's not funny, and that we don't agree with certain behaviors that might cause that sexual violence.
That is so important. I think that's one of the most important things to have those difficult conversations. And sometimes it is scary because I've had those conversations. It is scary. You can feel scared if they're going to judge you for some reason. But it is so important that truly change comes within us, right? Within our networks. And that's how we move forward. Now, Sandra, now that we're talking about, youth and all these things, that the statistic that you shared before, as you know, sexual violence can start from a very, very young age. How can we effectively support our teens, and how can we create spaces where they can, have honest conversations about these topics, and how can we empower our youth?
I think that the point of our empowerment project was really a pilot program that started, like I said, in Andros High School, and it's grown to other schools. I think they're in Canotillo and then Socorro, and so they're really trying to connect. And so I think that as a community, or collaboratively, working within your community with your local rape crisis center, and us working with like your schools, parents, individuals, to be able to essentially give the youth the opportunity to be heard. And I know that sounds weird because, you think of social media and everything that they post, that you think, well, they're always heard, right? They're communicating all the time. But I think oftentimes we tend to minimize our young adults in our community. For instance, when they start relationships, it's not really a relationship. It's, it's not, there's going to be other loves in your life, or whatever that may be. But those relationships, it's not like an on and off switch. It doesn't mean that at some point, you tick over to 21, and now starting from this day forward, all these relationships are valid, right? And they're important. And the other ones, well, they weren't important. The way we love and the way we create relationships isn't an on and off switch. You start with relationships at such a young age, when, with your parents, with your family. And so I think for youth, starting those conversations and weaving it into our school system and not being afraid to do so. I think oftentimes when you think of sexual awareness, sexual assault, domestic violence, or any conversation with, the word sex in it, it's, I don't want my children to be exposed to that because I don't want them to get an idea that I'm agreeing with something or another. And so it's not about that. It's about, they are getting ideas, and they're probably getting it from the wrong sources, because they are viewing things more now than ever. Young children have access to pretty much everything with smartphones. And so I think it's being conscientious and taking account to appropriateness in terms of age is really important. But I think shying away from it is where historically we've always said, people get the wrong information from friends and family sometimes, or they make up their own information, which is incorrect.
Yes, I know when I was in high school, you would get your information from, your friends and what they were experiencing because
Conversations are looking like.
yeah,
Yeah,
because you would only get this information from a health class and it was like a one-time thing and that was it.
exactly. And like your junior year or something, like
Yes.
you were already almost out of high school.
Yes, and especially, well, I was in private school, right? So those topics are even like a big no, 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 so, and it's nothing scary, it's part of life. And that's why we need to normalize these topics because of course, we want a youth to get the right information and to have the right tools to defend themselves when they're out there in the world. And now going a little bit back into healing and, for people who are listening to this and might have had an experience or know someone who has an experience with sexual violence, what services do you think are most valuable for a person in a healing path from sexual violence in a short term and long term?
So I think that the most important thing is when someone makes an outcry, however, either insignificant you think it is, or and I know it sounds harsh when I'm saying the word insignificant because sometimes people will hear something and be like, oh, that's not a big deal. It is a big deal. If they're vocalizing it to you, it's because they were affected by it. And so I think the main thing is to ensure that that individual feels that they're believed and that they're not being judged. And that even if I don't know where to send them as an individual, is, you know what, we're going to do it together and I'm going to help you find something. So on the short term, it's simple. Just believe. Don't judge. Don't question. Don't blame. On the long term, there's obviously the long-term component of this is going to be a work in progress. And so depending on the individual's coping skills, situations, on reoccurring either thoughts, times of year, smells, there's triggers that sometimes as an individual, they're not aware that they have. And so part of that is seeking help. And what that help looks like will look different for different individuals, whether it's talking to a caseworker and that's the person you feel most comfortable with. Hopefully getting into therapy is a huge component, and connecting with those individuals and making sure that you're working through that process and understanding that it's not just a set of, an 8 to 10 sessions, life has been solved and you're going to be okay. It might be that, you take us a couple of sessions and I feel okay now, and people drop off. It happens. Life happens. And then in another several months or years, something happens that causes me to go right back to that incident. And so I feel like I need support again. And so reaching out for that support again at that point. And so the long term is going to be completely obviously individualized to everyone's own needs. The main thing is to be able to identify what those needs are at that particular time and know that, agencies like ours with the center the incident didn't just have to happen. We understand the complexities of it and completely understand that you might need to access services 10 years after your assault, and might come a couple of times, and then several months later might come again. And so it's really at your pace, but also looking and ensuring that you're getting the help that you need, and knowing that it's going to be a road. It's a road to recovery.
Right. Whatever the services look for you, right? I know I shared a couple of times in this podcast that my healing journey began with yoga. That's when through meditation, I realized, there are some things that I need to discuss with a professional, and it's ongoing. I feel that everyone's healing path is ongoing, and it doesn't have an expiration date. I was just in a counseling session a few minutes ago before we started our interview, and I told her, I am starting to really realize that healing journeys are not linear. They're never linear. And whatever that service looks like for you, it might look counseling session at first, and then, later on it looks something different, but definitely getting the help that you may need is important. And realizing that there's so many options, that's why the main reason why we wanted to provide non-traditional therapy through our FRC, because we realized that, there might be a stigma, and that's okay if you can start with non-traditional at first and then ease your way into traditional therapy and provide different options, because we're not the same, right? That way our healing journey looks different.
Right. No, and I think that once you come to realize what works for you, because I think the other big thing that we've talked to our clients a lot about is you also have to, aside from the type of therapy you're receiving, right? So whether it's EMDR, whether it's cognitive, whether it's group therapy, individual therapy, it's also you have to connect with that individual who's providing that service. If you're unable to build trust, just because the individual's a therapist doesn't mean that, the gates open up and that makes sense and this is going to now be the savior. It's going to work. It really needs to feel natural to you as an individual. Understand also that there might be points where they're challenging you, right? And pushing you to kind of process a particular incident. Mm-hmm. But really figuring out what works best for you. And unfortunately, I don't have the answer for that. So you as an individual have to try different modes of therapy and of services to see what feels right, what you connect with. And then that's when you'll see the biggest, I don't want to say result, but where you'll get the most out of that particular service.
Yes, that's what I always discuss with close friends, because I am very open about mental health and, there's topics that surround mental health. And they ask me, like, where can I go? Would you have any recommendation? And I tell them, I do. I have these people in mind, but just be aware that there has to be a connection. And maybe at the first session, you're not going to feel that connection and you might feel more comfortable with another person, but don't let that be, don't let that stop you from seeking professional help if you need it, because that's definitely important. We all connect with different people, just like as we do with our friends. We have different people in our lives that we connect stronger with. So mental health professionals, I think, work the same. This is United and Resilient. We'll be right back.
My name is David Stout, and I'm a county commissioner here in El Paso, Texas. I represent Precinct 2. The Walmart where the shooting happened on August 3rd is actually located within the precinct that I represent. Where was I on August 3rd? I had just gotten back from a work trip to Austin, and was having breakfast with some friends over in Ciudad Juarez. And all of a sudden I received a text message that said that there was an active shooter situation in the Cielo Vista area. And immediately I was confused, because I really didn't know what was going on, and I would never have thought that something like that would ever come across my cell phone being here in El Paso. So I immediately crossed back to El Paso and made contact with University Medical Center with Jacob Cintron, the CEO over there, because I expected that if there were any victims, anybody who was hurt, that they would maybe have been taken to UMC since it's close by. He did confirm that they were receiving patients, and so I got myself together, and a little bit later actually went down to UMC, and where Dr. Tyrock, who's the head of trauma at UMC, and Jacob Cintron did a press conference to talk about the patients that they were receiving and the treatment that they were giving to them, and within those patients was actually a baby. So I actually ended up doing an interview in Spanish after the press conference to help with the Spanish language TV stations. And, it was just really difficult because I really didn't know what to say. This is something that we never expected to happen here in El Paso. And as more details came in and more information came in as to who the shooter was and what the motivation for the shooting was, it just it was just so heartbreaking. And as the hours passed and the next couple of days, there wasn't a lot of sleep to be had. We had the opportunity to visit the site at the school behind where the shooting took place, where families were being serviced and waiting to hear about their family members. And it was just very sad and just very difficult. I can't even imagine how those folks were feeling as they were sitting there waiting for the news regarding their loved ones. But, the way that this community responded, the way that, our EMS and first responders showed up and did what they had to do, the way that our folks at UMC at the hospital took care of these folks, all of the training and education that they have gone through, they put it into motion and they knew exactly what to do. And the way that this community came together and in unity, not just that day, but, in the days after and the weeks and months after, especially doing things like creating the Family Resiliency Center and making sure that folks are being taken care of. It was really uplifting and very heartening to see how this community unified. And I really hope that this never happens to another community. But the way that we responded was just amazing, and it made me really proud to be an El Pasoan.
Now, Sandra, I want to talk a little bit about domestic violence. I know this topic is surrounding sexual violence, but I definitely think domestic violence is equally as important. So could you briefly discuss the importance of raising awareness of domestic violence? How are they related to sexual violence, and how are they, and if they are treated differently?
So domestic violence, and how they're related, so the movement of domestic violence, we love wheels. If you just Google power and control wheel, you'll find the power and control wheel usually with an equality wheel on the other side. And so if you look at that wheel, what you'll notice is domestic violence, there's a lot of, there's verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual. Those are the 4 categories that we generally will do an assessment around. So verbal and emotional is what's on the wheel in itself. It's talking about all these things and they're called tactics that are utilized within an unhealthy relationship. All, again, nothing being physical. It's just all verbal and emotional. And if you look at the same wheel, the outer part of the wheel will illustrate physical and sexual violence. So what happens is in these relationships, when these tactics, and there's 8 of them that are all verbal and emotional, are being utilized, and then at some point they stop working, or the offender feels that they're not working, they will then incorporate physical and sexual violence more often than not. There isn't anything that shows there's a timeline. I can't tell you most relationships will be verbal and emotionally abusive X amount of time before they become physically or sexually abusive. Each situation, again, is very individualized, but their correlation is it's the escalation of, if you want to think of it as even step 4, right? It's an escalation of the abuse that gets to the physical and sexual violence. In terms of how they're treated differently, I will tell you in 2015 is when we became your local rape crisis center. We incorporated those sexual assault services into the center's mission, and we started providing those services in the hospital with hospital accompaniment. And I remember when we rolled out the concept, we had been working with victims of sexual assault prior to this, in conjunction with the old rape crisis center that was in our community. And, I always thought with domestic violence, it was hard in our community to talk to people about it, because they often felt like the victim has a choice and they're choosing not to leave these relationships. And so we do a lot of education around there's these dynamics that are happening within domestic violence and that are causing these barriers. And so it's not as easy to leave. People often say, well, if everybody ever hit me, I would automatically leave. Well, generally the relationship doesn't start with a first-time physical attack, because then obviously you would have left. There's a building up to it, unfortunately. There's children, there's emotional connections, there's all these circumstances. But when we started providing sexual assault services, I was really shocked at the response and some of the calls that we were receiving from our community. So we did this campaign around, we're now providing these services. If you need help, call our Hope line. And I remember the first week we had gotten some, I thought, to me, shocking calls in terms of people in our community calling us and saying, essentially victim blaming. Like, we need to teach individuals, how to dress and, where to not go and not to drink if they're youth. And I was so disappointed because, like I said, I think we've made, leaps and bounds in terms of progress as a society. And then you're reminded that there's still a ways to go, unfortunately. So while I think that, I don't think that this is the way the majority of El Paso thinks by any means, but there is still a significant amount of individuals, right? So to me, significant is even if it's 10% of the population, that's still too much for me, because these conversations are still happening. And what's more heartbreaking to me is that there's people listening to these conversations, right? Where they are victim blaming. And so it completely opened up my eyes that, oh my God, I thought people saw domestic violence, really was always blaming the victim and how horrible that is. But when we opened ourselves up to sexual assault, I was like, oh my God, it's 100 times worse. There's just so much work to be done in terms of how we're even just having conversations and perceptions of these individuals who are going through it. And so you have these conversations at home, right? Your kids are listening to you when you watch the news and you make a comment about, a particular case. And so I don't think we give that enough weight, because if I'm saying something negative about either a domestic violence news story or a sexual assault news story, I have 2 boys. They're young adults now. They're 18 and 22. But I'm affecting how they think about the world, right? If they were ever sexually assaulted and they were, and I'm constantly saying things like, oh, it can never happen to a man. You know what I mean? You're not a real man if you let it happen, or real men, that they wouldn't have been sexually assaulted because, they would have enjoyed it, type of thing. Do you think that they're going to come and disclose to me, if they were faced with that same circumstance? No. Right?
No.
Right. And so I think that, I don't think we realize how desde chiquitos, right? Since they're little, we're already creating and affecting our children's thoughts and ideas. Mm-hmm. And what is safe to tell mom and dad, because I've seen how they react. And so, and not to say that I have it right, because by all means, they don't come with an instruction book, unfortunately.
Of course.
But I try really hard in terms of communication. And then what I would say for parents is, if you're going to have open communication, you also can't choose when to close that door, right? So you have to be ready for anything and everything they might say, even though I don't agree with some of the stuff that they might be saying or sharing. But you have to really pick and choose and what needs to be addressed, right? And what's part of growing up. And then even when I am trying to address or help them with something, that it's not punitive. It's not I know better because I'm an adult, because the world that, and I kind of sound like my mom now, but the world that I grew up was very different than the world now, right? I didn't have social media or a constant cool phone that I was walking around with all the time. So unfortunately, I think we'll all get to the point where we'll say things like, well, back in my day, it wasn't like that. But it's true, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know.
So I'm glad they're having those conversations with me, but I'm like, oh my God, I told my husband, did you just hear what he said? And he's like, I did. And I'm like, I didn't know what to say. He's like, neither did I. And that's okay, right? Because sometimes they will tell me, Mom, I'm going to tell you something, but I don't want you to tell me anything. I just want you to listen. And I told them, you need to tell me that because I'm a problem solver, right? I want to fix it. And so if you don't want me to fix it, then tell me, I just want you to hear me. And that's what I'll do. And it's hard. It's so hard.
Right. I'm thinking about, I'm just thinking about when I was a kid and there was this like conversation going around in school that we were like, have your parents had the talk with you? And it was just one conversation, right? It was just one day where our parents were really uncomfortable and we were uncomfortable and we had that conversation and that's it. You never talk about it again. And it's so important to keep the conversation going, like you said. And I'm thinking about one of my friends. She was a young mom. She had her baby as a young teenager, and now as she's growing up, her daughter, they have a very open conversations about these issues. And I just really admire her because I'm like, again, like I said in the beginning, I wish I had that. I wish I had all those tools from a very, very young age. And so yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Now, as we head towards our, I'm so sorry that this conversation is ending. I'm enjoying this so much. I think this topic is so important. But now I'm thinking about like the call to action items that we need to discuss. April is as I mentioned, is Sexual Violence Awareness Month. But how can we take awareness to action? How can we get involved? How can we raise awareness from where we are into our workspaces, with our families, with our friends? How can we get more involved in as a hands-on?
So sexual assault, like you said, is or April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so our campaign for actually this month is three simple questions. So consent starts with 3 words. Is it okay? It's that simple. So what we're going to try to focus on or ensure is that, or the call to action, if you will, is to start practicing consent with your friends and family. So if you think about, work, we're constantly asking like, hey, do you want to go to lunch? Hey, is it okay? Can I come in? Whatever. We tend to extend certain courtesies to individuals not within our same household that we don't necessarily replicate at home. And so when you're thinking about consent with our kids even, and just what we do even as Hispanics, in terms of, when you come into a household, the first thing we do is saludamos, right? Like saluda tu tía, say hi to your aunt, your cousin, whoever. For a male, it's perfectly acceptable to allow them to shake hands, right? Or wave or whatnot. For a female, the expectation is what?
A kiss.
Exactly. Abrázalo y dale un beso, right? Mm-hmm. And we do it with our kids since they were little, especially little girls. And we don't give them the option to consent because there's nothing wrong with her waving or saying hi, but that's not the expectation. The expectation is you will hug and kiss everyone, a stranger or not, or family member, you're going to do it to everyone. And so I would extend the idea of consent around those circumstances, consent around, we're in the day and age of social media where we take pictures of everything and post it. And so one thing is when our kids are babies, right, or toddlers, we do it and we share it and that's perfectly fine. But as a young adult growing up, when you're feeling awkward, when you're, we're trying to instill like what consent is exercise that practice with your preteens and your adolescents. Is when is it okay for me to take your picture? Out of the pictures, which one do you like? Which one can I post, right? Is it okay if I post it? And I know sometimes for some people this might feel a little weird, but if we don't start somewhere with basic things that we want them to later on practice of, why did you put that picture up of yourself doing X, Y, and Z? It's because we never taught it to them from the beginning. Again, I really love this campaign of, it just starts with 3 words. Is it okay?
I love that. Thank you so much, Sandra. It's something that I'm definitely going to incorporate with my own family. Definitely when they open the door and I'm working. Sandra, now my last question would be, what is a message of hope for people out there who are listening?
The message of hope is that the community of El Paso is here to help you. Regardless whether it's something with domestic violence, sexual assault, the heinous victimization that we all experienced in August, is that El Paso is a community that truly cares about one another. And if you ask for help, there is help available. And so I keep repeating this to a few individuals, is while there's a solution, right? While there's a process or an option for help, there's hope. And so to me, that's the main thing. I'll worry about something when there's like a dead end and I feel like there's no option. But ask for help, look for it, demand it for yourself. And that's the hope that I think that our community lends to one another.
I love that. There are so many helping hands in our community, and I think that was the standard, and that's what we saw on August 3rd, right? So many helping hands. So, Sandra, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for this conversation. Like I said, I really enjoyed it, and it was very insightful. So thank you.
No, thank you for the opportunity, Mariana. It was a pleasure.